What's up, everybody? My name is Austin Haney, and today we are going to talk about 3 common pitfalls that almost all teachers fall in and how lesson planning can help you get through them. So if you're a new teacher, tell me if any of these issues sound familiar to you. 1, you're spending way too much time lesson planning. You know it, your friends know it, your team knows it, everybody knows it, but you can't figure out how to plan a lesson more efficiently. The second big issue is you have questions about pacing. So how much can I put in a lesson? How long do my activities last? Are my students going to think this is really easy or this is really hard? How are they going to respond? You've got issues with pacing. And the third thing, which we'll talk more about at the end, is maybe you've fallen into the trap where you've begun to focus more on your own teaching than on your students' learning. And that's not satisfying to you. You know that maybe inside it's wrong, but you don't know how to get out of that negative pattern. Well, in this video, we're going to talk about all 3 of those things, and all 3 of those things are something that can be solved with more effective lesson planning and, of course, with more experience. And so I thought that we would jump right in with number 1, and we would just talk about time. So one of the strongest memories I have from my first year of teaching is feeling like lesson planning took me so much time, and then making a PowerPoint took even more time, and finding activities that like my students would like and that I thought were interesting and that fit into our unit, that took even more time, and time began to expound upon time and time and time, and all of a sudden I was spending hours and hours planning a pretty simple lesson. And I realized that if I didn't find a new way of lesson planning, that I was putting myself on a direct path towards burnout. So to explain why lesson planning used to take me so much time, I want to give you 2 illustrations, and it's about sandcastles and cookies. So the first one is sandcastles. And if you've ever been to the beach and tried to make a sandcastle, you know that you can really put a lot of effort into it and a lot of energy into it, but sooner or later, the waves are going to knock it over. And that used to be exactly how I felt like teaching was. I would spend so much time preparing a lesson and trying to make it look beautiful and decorating it and like having everything built together. And then I would teach the lesson and then it would be over. And I'd have to wait a whole nother year before I would ever see that lesson again. And so I started to get this like stress of feeling like I could not build beautiful sandcastles as quickly as the waves would knock them over. So I needed to find a way to make my sandcastles last, or to at least make them connected to something that would last longer than every individual lesson. In other words, I needed to make my lessons connected. So the second illustration is baking cookies. In my house, my sister loves to bake, and so we have eaten a lot of cookies. But imagine if you're making 24 cookies or something like that. And you took time, every cookie, you rolled it out, you mixed the ingredients, you sprayed the pan, you heated it for however long it needs to be heated, you brought it out, you served it, and then you went back, cleaned the dishes, and then you repeated the whole process over for all 24 cookies. What usually would take like, I don't know, maybe 30 minutes or something to make 24 cookies, now would take you hours and hours and hours, okay? Because you're doing all the steps individually and you're repeating it every single time. So what's very simple to see from that illustration is we've got to have a way of batching. We've got to have a way of stirring all the ingredients together at one time, or finding all the ingredients that we're going to need at one time, going shopping at the grocery store only one time. And the better we can get at batching, the more efficient we're going to be in our time management. So the question becomes, well, if we need to be batching and we need our lessons to be connected, how exactly do we do that? So I've got a few tips for you, and the first tip that I want to give you is that as a new teacher, you need to become familiar with your curriculum and the objectives that you have and what teachers have done in the past. So this is going to be something that takes a little bit of time, and it's going to take effort for you to understand what teachers have done in the past. It's going to take effort for you to read through the textbook and kind of look at how the lessons fit together, or to see how the textbook teaches different activities. It's going to take time for you to familiarize yourself with all of that. But it will take you significantly less time to make yourself familiar with that than to go and to completely find new things to do all by yourself. Because you'll understand what has already been done, and then you'll know where you want to tweak and change things based on a current standard. The second big tip here is to begin to use backwards design. And what I mean is you should go ahead and think through your assessments, think through what the students are going to use your class for, Think through what is the end goal of this lesson or this unit or even this semester, and then begin to use backwards design to prepare yourself and your students along the way on a lesson by lesson or even an activity by activity basis. I mentioned this in a previous video, but what I found is when I didn't do this, I began to summarize my activities as my objectives rather than letting those objectives drive what activities we did. And you don't want that. You want to make sure that your objectives are setting the priority and setting the objective or the goal for your class. This last tip kind of goes with that, but the third reason why I think it's super important to understand your objectives and where you're going with your unit, but also with each individual lesson, you need to know not what are you going to teach, but how are you going to teach it. So when you begin searching for what to teach, there are so many options, it's overwhelming and it's super, super time consuming. But when you begin asking, how do I teach this? For example, how do I teach this pronunciation part, or how do I teach this specific grammar concept, or how do I teach, whatever is specific to your category. Whenever you begin searching for something like how to rather than what to, the more specific your search becomes, the shorter your search becomes, because you begin to find what you're looking for much, much quicker. And this leads to a huge time saving for you. So the second big pitfall that I've fallen into and that many of my friends that are teachers have fallen into is not really understanding pacing. So as a new teacher, maybe you've got 90 minutes in class, but it's hard to know whether an activity will take 10 minutes or whether it should take 25 minutes, or is this going to take 60 minutes, or is this only going to be a few minutes activity that we can just breeze through? It's also really hard to understand, is this going to be a super easy activity for my students, or is this going to be a super challenging activity? And if it is going to be challenging, how can I scaffold them up to the place they need to be? So a few tips that I have for you is, first, nobody really knows exactly how long an activity is going to take, because there's so many factors there. It could be your student's ability level, it could be your ability to explain the instructions, it could be the resources, the materials that you've got available, it could be the seating arrangements and how flexible they are and how pre-set up they already are. There's so many factors that go into how long an activity takes that no one knows exactly how long it is. With that said, what will be helpful to you as a new teacher is that you still make estimates for how long it takes. So let's say you plan for 15 minutes. You should get in the classroom and know, all right, I'm planning for this to be 15 minutes, which means I'm planning for this activity to take me until 10:30, let's say. But then when 10:30 hits, you should write down on your lesson plan, like, we've still got 5 more minutes in this activity. Like, this activity took me longer than I expected. Or this activity took me a lot less time than I expected. Either way, you should make little notes on that so that you can begin to get a better feel for your estimates and whether you should be planning for longer or planning for something shorter. Another tip I have for you in pacing is that you begin to familiarize yourself and get comfortable with a proven method for teaching. So for example, when many of us started teaching, we used something called the PPP model, which is present, practice, produce. And what's really nice about that model is no matter how many activities you have, you constantly present, and then you practice, and then you produce. And then if you do another activity, you present, and then you practice, and then you produce. Now there's lots of other models available, and maybe I'll do a whole video about some of the other models available at some point. But the more you familiarize yourself with a model like that, you can begin to understand, okay, presenting usually takes me this much time. Practice, I should allow this much time. Produce, it's going to take this much time. Okay? And you can begin to make a pretty simple lesson with a string of present, practice, and produce. Now personally, the present, practice, produce model is actually not my favorite, and I use something a little bit different in my own class. But what is nice about that model is that it always ends in produce. And when you end in produce, you have something that is by nature extendable. And so if you reach a point in class where you've got 5 minutes left or you've got 10 minutes left and you kind of need to like push this activity a little bit, the present, practice, produce model gives you a way to just extend this by having groups share or having individuals share or giving a little bit of feedback. And I found that to be super helpful at getting me through some tough spots when I kind of underplanned how much I was going to need. And one more tip I would give you, especially as a new teacher, is to take time to plan at least 1 or 2 back pocket activities. Now this can be something that you recycle over and over, but I can tell you as a new teacher, I really did not spend enough time thinking about this. And I do remember one time early on when I was teaching in my first semester that I had taught everything I was supposed to teach for that day, and we still had about 20 minutes left in class. And so what I did is I extended my produce as long as I could. I asked a bunch of questions. I got more students to share. I asked them follow-up questions, but I was kind of straining up there. So I started telling them a story, and then eventually we ran out of time and things kind of like worked out. But it was one of those like, whew, situations. And you don't really want too many of those as you're teaching, because it just causes a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety and a lot of thinking on your feet. So a back pocket activity can really help in those situations. So I recommend you Googling one, or you asking your teammate about one, or trying to think of one yourself. But just think about something you can do if you've got a little bit of extra time and need to find a good and productive way to use that time. And so that brings us to the third pitfall, which is when we begin to think more about our own teaching than our students' learning. And I actually want to go back to our pacing example and tell you a story about this. So I was asking a fellow teacher, like, what do you do if you run out of time? And they said that one time they ran out of time in their class and they wound up playing hangman with their class. But they said as they were sitting there playing the game and kind of like trying to hope that the minutes tick by as quickly as possible, they felt a little bit like that person hanging up there on the board. They said they started to feel all these emotions of, I wonder if my students like can see my inexperience, or if they think that I'm a bad teacher, or that I'm unprepared, or if they think that I'm wasting their time. And all these like feelings and fears and embarrassment and hurt pride and all this can kind of like come together. And because of that, we begin to think more about our own teaching than about our students' learning. So I'll give you a few examples of how this has shown up in my own teaching. And one example is just way over preparing lessons. So I didn't want to ever have to face the feeling of not having anything to teach. And so when I was a new teacher, I used to plan a bunch of extra activities. And because of that, I was spending a lot of unnecessary time planning. And then I would try to squeeze all those extra activities into our lesson. And we just kind of got through everything quickly rather than really digging into anything in a rich way. And so that was over planning, but it came from this fear of not having something to talk about. Another example is that sometimes I would ask questions in class and my students wouldn't answer. And it just made me feel so awkward. And I felt like our students felt awkward. I felt awkward. What are we supposed to do in this situation? And so I began to not ask as many questions in the class and really explain things and really talk. And my teacher talk time was going up, 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 up. It wasn't that I thought that was a better way of teaching. It was simply that I got nervous whenever I left the floor open and asked this open-ended question because I didn't know how the students were going to respond. There's a lot of other ways that this fear and this perfectionism can kind of like start to show its ugly head, whether it's over-decorating the PowerPoint or having this internal anxiety for what are the students thinking about me? Do they like me? Am I good enough? All this kind of stuff. And I think a lot of teachers feel this and maybe just haven't articulated it or haven't found a good solution to that problem. And the reason these problems are so personal and so touchy and so sensitive to us is they really play at our identity, at our purpose for why we're doing what we're doing. Why are we teaching? Do we even matter as a person? And so if we don't find a way to answer these questions, it can lead us directly on the road to stress and burnout and feelings of like, we're just horrible. And I don't want that for you. I don't want that for me. So one of the best tips that I've been given on how to deal with this is to think about lesson planning like a chef thinks about preparing a meal. Now, of course, there are all kinds of ways that meals are prepared. There's the meal that's whipped up just in time, the meal that is leftovers from the night before or from a few weeks before even. There's the meal that's like the 10-course delicacy that was prepared by a master chef. There's different types of chefs too. There's chefs that are so experienced they don't even need a plan when they go in and cook. They just see what's on the table and they start going to work and it's beautiful. And there's other chefs that honestly, they need every single step written out if they're going to make something that tastes good and that's productive. So what I've come to see is that lesson planning is a lot like preparing a meal. Now, depending on where you are, there's quite a variety of skill levels and resources available and ideas regarding what is the best practice. But ultimately, everyone that prepares a meal does it to serve others. And when we're teaching, our ultimate goal is not for our students to say, wow, our teacher is so wonderful. It's for them to learn and to be served. And when we do that, we're going to find satisfaction in our work. And when we don't do that, we're going to find burnout and fear and frustration and dissatisfaction. And so you've got to ask in your own context, what's really driving me? And is my goal to serve my students? And if it is to serve my students, how can I do that even better? Is it that I need to learn more about teaching? I need to learn more about languages and how languages work. I need to understand how to teach this lesson, or I need to work on my own teaching so that I don't get in the way of their learning. Whatever it is, you've got to figure that out for your own context, but I encourage you to do that. And ultimately, that's why I made this channel, because I truly believe that we are better together and that our shared knowledge can really be helpful in helping us improve as teachers, but also helping us better serve and love our students. So if you've got a question for an issue you face as a teacher and you'd like for us to discuss that together as a teaching community, I encourage you to leave a comment down below and we'll try to make a video answering that specific question. And if you're just interested in continuing to follow along with these videos, I also encourage you to hit the subscribe button, hit the bell, get notified so that you can continue to follow along with this together. But let's all get better together, continue to serve and to love our students, and I cannot wait to see you in the next video. Bye, guys.